Thank you, and good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thumbs up if you enjoyed the lunch. That was good. Now here's my challenge. My challenge is to keep everyone awake, and I will do my best to do so. I learned from young Zhao that you should include humor in your presentations. So here's something I thought you would enjoy to keep you awake. This isn't a true story from a kindergarten teacher, the experience she had in her classroom one morning. And so it did. So, could I ask you to raise your hand if you fall into any of the categories? I want to see who's here. How many of you teach at the primary level? Good afternoon, welcome. Teachers at secondary level? Hello and good afternoon. Anyone here from university level? Welcome, good afternoon. School-based administrators, principals, assistants, and others at the school level. Hello and welcome to you. Anyone here works particularly with curriculum? Good afternoon. Anyone here from a board, school board, or trustees group? Hello, and others who are here. We're glad you're here. So I have been asked to share with you ideas about the framework of understanding by design, and that's what I will do in the next hour or so. In a summary, I will propose to address the following topics. The quote, big ideas of understanding by design, and then engage you in a little exercise around the question. So what is understanding? We'll take a look at what Graham Wiggins and others call backward design as a process for curriculum planning. And as time permits, I will share with you what I think are wonderful resources that support teaching and learning and the kind of curriculum proposed by myself and our colleagues. The session this afternoon is going to focus on what Michael referred to this morning as the micro level. These are ideas for teachers for classroom practice. Tomorrow morning in my session, I'm going to be looking at the macro level. What do these ideas mean at the school level or for networks of schools? So that will be more at the macro level. Now, one of the things I'm committed to doing, especially in an afternoon session, is to keep the session engaging. And one way I'll do that is through the use of a technique that's on the screen. So, several times during our next hour, I will pause the presentation and invite you to converse with people seated nearby. During these periodic pauses, it's a chance for you to summarize what for you are key ideas, a chance to add your own thoughts. How does this idea or this example relate to your work, or what ideas come to mind? And if there are questions that come up from something I say, you might bring your questions up with your group mates. So my intent is to give you a chance for active processing of information during the course of the next hour. To use this technique, could I invite you now to identify a couple of people seated nearby? 3, 4, up to 5 people will work well. It could be people in your row, or it could be back and forth between rows. Could you please identify a group? We will use these pauses during our time together. Have a little bell. Not terribly loud, but you'll hear it. When you hear the bell, it's a request to you to wrap up your conversations in your pause breaks. Now, here is a standing offer. Since these conferences involve lots of sitting, and it's after lunch in a dark room, I'm going to invite you, when we have these pauses, if you wish, to stand with your group mates. Okay, that's a standing offer, unintended. So, let me begin with an interesting and important finding from Dr. Robert Marzano. Bob Marzano is a researcher that looks at meta-analysis of different studies And one of his conclusions from a meta-analysis presented in his book, What Works in Schools, is on the screen. Marzano found in his research a synthesis that one of the most important factors at the school level is a guaranteed and viable curriculum delivered to all students. Number one factor, in fact, relating to student achievement. Now, important to note, this was at the school level, not the classroom level. We know that good teachers impact learning in their classrooms. But a good teacher working by him or herself without a coherent and focused curriculum will not have the same effect as good teachers working together with the same goals and a coherent curriculum in mind. This is important research, and it's important especially in my experience in independent schools. Because an independent school doesn't mean everyone can be independent and do what they want. In fact, the best independent schools have collective focus on long-term results driven by a mission, and we collectively work toward those. And we have a curriculum that is aligned to those outcomes. Understanding by design is basically a curriculum planning framework. I believe it helps us to identify, to develop a viable curriculum. Here is what understanding by design is not, if you are new to this. Understanding by design is not a program. Rather, it's a way of thinking, a way of planning, a way of focusing and prioritizing teaching, and looking to gather evidence appropriate to our goals that can inform and help us improve. Understanding by design is not an instructional model per se, although there are implications for how we teach, and I'll be getting into that in my follow-up session today. And finally, some people, when they're introduced to understanding by design, will say, well, this doesn't work for mathematics, or this doesn't work for teaching language. With all due respect, I disagree. I think understanding by design is compatible for any subject or any mission-related goal, like critical thinking or citizenship, if one of our goals is to help students understand and transfer their learning. So these are some things that understanding by design is not. My first chunk is going to look at the big ideas of understanding by design, and there were two suggested by its title. One big idea in understanding by design is the focus of our teaching and our curriculum toward understanding, developing student capacity to understand. Well, you might say, well, of course. Doesn't every teacher want his or her students to understand what they teach? Well, perhaps, but the devil's in the details. A focus on understanding raises an immediate question. What's worth understanding in all that we have to teach? Because every teacher I know from pre-K to university faces a common problem. We all know what it is. There's typically too much content and not enough time. So a focus on understanding helps us to focus and prioritize around the most important ideas. And what are the most important ideas? In my view, they're the ideas that promote and support transfer, that enable students to use their knowledge in new, meaningful, interesting, even unpredictable ways. In a world where we can Google much of the world's information on a smartphone, I think it changes our priorities of teaching. The goal is not to have everything on call in your head, as much as it is the ability to find information and to use it meaningfully and to be able to transfer it to new situations of the sort that Young described this morning. If we are clear about the important ideas and processes that we want students to really understand so that they can transfer their learning, this has implications for our assessments. Our assessments, in my view, have to go beyond just seeing if kids know things. We have to include among our assessments opportunities for students to show they understand by applying their learning to new situations. The second big idea in understanding by design is by design. We propose that we plan our curriculum backward with the ends of understanding and transfer in mind. Does this mean we don't care about basic knowledge or basic skills? Of course it doesn't. But my contention in our 21st century school world is that the basics are necessary but insufficient. They are the building blocks that are necessary for students to try to transfer their learning. More about that in a moment. So if we agree that understanding is a worthy goal of education, it raises an important question. So what is understanding? We need clarity about such an end. And understanding is a tricky word. It has different connotations. And so it merits spending time asking this question. Because it's afternoon session, and because I want to engage you in a little thinking, I want to ask you to think about understanding. How do you define it? What do you look for to see if a student really gets it? And what's the difference between someone who knows a lot but doesn't really understand that material versus someone who has a deep understanding? These are questions I want to pose to you and ask you to think about and talk about in a moment. One way of thinking about this question is to use a T-chart. So you could think about the two columns. And you can think about any topic or content. It could be something you understand, or it could be something you teach and you want students to understand. But I'd like you to think about the distinction between someone, including yourself, who really understands that. What would they do? How would they show it? How would you know it? Versus, on the right side, someone who may know some things about the topic but doesn't really understand it deeply. What could that person do or not do? So I want you to think about that for a minute by yourself. And then I'm going to ask you to talk with your group mates, and you can stand up if you wish. So 1 minute by yourself. What is understanding, and what are the differences you envision? Actually, can I interrupt? I want to show you an example, then I'll stop talking. Here's an illustration that I think is an interesting one. This was a math problem on a sample test given in the U.S. a few years ago. It was given to 8th grade students, and it was a multiple choice selected response format. Interestingly, when they scored the test and did an item analysis, they found that nearly 1/3 of all students selected the same incorrect answer. And I bet it won't surprise many of you. What do you think the same incorrect answer involved? A fraction, a decimal, part of a bus. Indeed, nearly 1/3 of the kids answered. Or selected the answer, 31 remainder 12. It was an option. And I was curious to see what a remainder 12 bus might look like, so I drew it in there, down in the corner. Someone said it's a mini bus. Someone else said the answer is 1. I said, how so? He said, ever been in the Army? There's one bus, you just wait for it to come to get you. But other than the Army answer, what does this answer suggest? Would you believe, or would you infer, that a student that selected the answer 31 remainder 12 understands division? I'm seeing yes, no, and maybe so. Yes, I would agree that they may know the division process, and they may know their math facts, but they didn't apply division appropriately in the context of the problem. So we could, in terms of the T-chart, we could say someone may know the division algorithm, and they may know their math facts, but they haven't used division appropriately in this situation. So we might say they may know stuff, but they're not transferring effectively in a particular situation. So that was just one example I wanted to show you. So now I'm going to stop for 1 minute. I'm going to ask you not to talk. Just think to yourself, what would be other indicators of someone who understands something deeply versus someone who just may know things? 1 minute, and then I'll let you talk with each other. because I've done this exercise a bit, I have an idea of some of the things you may have said. See if you had any of these comments. I'm going to focus just on the verbs. So, someone who really understands can do the things on the left. Someone with only knowledge but not deep understanding is likely confined to the items on the left. Would you agree? In line with what you said? So we don't need great theoretical research to reflect what we know from our experience. There are certain indicators of understanding, as well as there are certain indicators of knowledge without understanding. In the example just given of the bus problem, the kids did a plug-in. They plugged in numbers into a memorized algorithm and got a fine answer unless you consider the problem. In that case, the answer didn't make sense. When we talk about applying, we're talking about application to new situations, problems you've never seen before, texts you've never read, issues you haven't yet fully considered. The ability to transfer, to apply to a new situation is arguably one of the most important 21st century skills, and it gives evidence of understanding. So let's go a little finer grained. If we were to categorize the group, the verbs, and these aren't an exclusive list, but examples on the left side, you'll notice that there are, broadly speaking, two categories that we could derive. And this is a simple, but I think effective conception of understanding, especially for assessment. What do we look for to see if students understand? Arguably, we can look at two things. We look at their ability to apply their learning to something new, and their ability to explain it. If you really understand something, you can put it in your own words. You can use an example not yet told to you. You can make appropriate analogies. You can teach someone else. And I bet you had some of those in your discussion just now. So a short answer to the question, what is understanding and what do we look for as evidence of it, is we ask students to apply their learning to something new and to explain it. And this isn't new. In math, we ask students to try to apply their knowledge to a new problem, a word problem, a complex and authentic problem, and show their reasoning. In literature, we ask them to read and interpret text, and to justify their interpretation by citing the text, etc., etc. So these aren't new ideas. But it does imply certain kinds of assessment, I believe, if understanding is one of our goals. Now, Graham Wiggins and I have a more nuanced conception of what is understanding, and I'm going to give you a short version of this, suggested by the uses of the term understand on the screen. Those of you who are not familiar with understanding by design, or maybe I'll do it the other way, those of you who are familiar with understanding by design know that we have a construct that we refer to as facets of understanding. And it's just a slightly more nuanced response to the question, what is understanding? We propose different ways in which understanding is revealed. I'm just going to touch on this briefly and then pause for you to converse. The first two at the top were mentioned. Application and explanation. Another facet involves interpretation. Interpret literally means to make sense of or to make meaning from. And we ask students to show their understanding of text by asking what's the main idea and what's between the lines. We ask students to interpret data. We've collected this data. What, if anything, is the pattern? What will happen next? How sure are you? Those are interpretive questions that we use, and I think we use them to see if kids understand. The three facets at the top of this graphic are, in my view, widely used and applicable across the curriculum, across subjects, across grade levels. Not new. But we also think there are some other facets or aspects of understanding that may be appropriate in some, but not all, circumstances. The fourth facet, perspective. One aspect of understanding is the ability to see things from different points of view, to recognize another side of the case. I may not agree with your position, but I can understand your argument. conception or connotation of the word understanding in popular media press was understanding as empathy. We feel their pain, we imagine what they're going through. It's a deliberate intellectual capacity to try to put yourself in the skin, to walk in someone's shoes. And it's a facet of understanding. Now, my experience is perspective and empathy may be more generally appropriate for the humanities. I mean, we do this in the arts, in literature, in history. Maybe less so in math, science, technology. Although you could argue that the whole idea of scientific paradigm is a capacity to see a perspective and or recognizing maybe other paradigms in play. The final facet we have at the bottom is qualitatively different than the other five. The other five are about understanding the world and data and text, experience. The last facet is about understanding oneself. Students who have self-understanding are aware of themselves as learners. They're metacognitive. They reflect on their learning. They can set goals. They're strategic. And they reflect on life experience. As opposed to the students that go through school and life as if every new experience is just that. They don't reflect, they don't learn from mistakes, they don't set goals and monitor progress. And many of us as teachers try to cultivate this aspect of metacognition and reflection. It's an important life and school skill. So taken together, we propose that when we think about the question, what is understanding and what do we look for as evidence of it, there are these different facets. So one last point, and I'll let you pause to converse. We do not propose that these facets represent a theory of how people come to understand. Rather, we think that this can be a practical construct that gives us ideas for evidence of understanding, and thus we can use this framework for assessment. It really is intended as a practical framework. Now, the last point before a pause, really important, and principles, I want you to hear this especially. We have never said, nor do we intend, that if you're going to assess for understanding, you have to have something in all these cells. I say that because I've heard teachers say to me, my principal says I have to have assessments for all of these, for every unit I teach, and it's hard. And I say, tell your principal she's mistaken. Rather, the question is, if this is something you want students to understand, through what facet or facets would they show that? Okay, so I just want you to get that. Not something in every cell. You're looking for evidence of understanding, and the facets can just be indicators. So with that said, let me pause once again. 3-minute pause to react to what you've heard. If you want to stand, feel free. So I want to take a look at the second big idea, which is backward design. So backward design is not a new idea, but it's a powerful idea for planning curriculum. And you can use this idea when planning a unit of study with lessons within. You can use it to plan an entire year. And you can use it to map the curriculum backward, 12 all the way down to pre-K, which is the macro view. So for those of you not already familiar with the way Grant Wiggins and I describe backward design, we propose 3 stages for planning. Straightforward. Stage 1, we identify desired results. Well, of course, anyone planning anything should have goals or outcomes in mind. But in understanding by design, we propose that our desired results are more than just a set of content objectives. This is where we ask the question, what are the most important things for students to understand as we explore this topic or body of knowledge or this skill? And we propose framing our teaching around essential questions that open the door to engage students in understanding. And we also specify more specific knowledge and skill objectives. Stage 1. Stage 2 of backward design, in many ways, is at the heart of this process. In stage 2, we ask people to think like assessors and ask the question, if these are the goals we're after, what evidence of learning, skill proficiency, and understanding do we need? That's where the facets of understanding come in. If understanding is one of your goals, we would look for evidence in one or more of those facets. We would also look at evidence of knowledge and skills, because those are objectives as well. Stage 3 is when we plan the learning experiences. Stage 3 is where lesson planning occurs. Day-to-day planning, what am I going to do on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, occurs in stage 3. What we propose, the best lessons are planned with clarity about the outcomes, the desired results, and thinking about the evidence in advance, not at the end. This is not a new idea. Dr. Ralph Tyler in 1949 wrote a classic book on curriculum planning in which he posed 3 essential questions. This is backward design, not a new idea. Now I'm going to ask for a show of hands, if you will, for the following questions. How many of you presently or at some time in your career have done any of the following? You teach or have taught visual and performing arts, physical education and health, something with career technology programs. You teach or have taught writing at any level. Well, by well, good for you. By well, I mean you don't just do grammar exercises and diagram sentences. You have kids write and revise. Okay? You teach or taught special education and plan IEPs for students. You have sponsored an extracurricular or club activity at secondary level. And you have coached a sport at any level or any sport. Okay, thank you. The reason I ask you to raise your hands is my experience is people who raise their hand are very familiar with backward design. It's what you do, naturally. But what do those raised hand areas have in common? They're all performance-based. We're working with kids on a product or performance, whether it's a persuasive essay in writing or getting better at football for the next game. In the product and performance-based areas, backward design is the norm. The results we're after are a high-quality product or performance. Our assessments are how well students perform. And our teaching and coaching is what we do to get them there. It's the norm. Some of you might get, I bet, were taught to plan this way in teacher preparation. But I also bet that some of you may be able to relate to my story, which was quite different. I started teaching in 1971. Back in the day, we didn't have what we now have as national standards or outcomes. So quite frankly, we had a lot more teaching freedom back then. So when I was planning as a beginning teacher, I had a general idea of results, but mostly it was dictated by the textbooks I used. I looked at the objectives in the chapters, and those were my objectives. Then I planned activities. And beyond my first year, when I was just getting my feet wet, I started getting out of the textbooks, because many of the textbooks were boring for the kids, and some were not even timely, they were dated. But this was before the internet. It was really hard to find interesting activities. I had to make a lot up. And some were interesting and engaging, but I have to admit not all were purposeful, because I wasn't as clear about desired results. The kids may be engaged, but they weren't always focused on meaningful, long-lasting learning, in other words. When I thought of assessment, I thought of assessment as something you did at the end of teaching to get a grade or a mark. And I learned you better have enough grades in your grade book, because when the report card time comes, you average all the grades, and you have to be able to justify to parents, students, what they got. That's just how I thought you did it. Ironically, I was a coach. I coached swimming. But I didn't apply what I knew and did in coaching to my teaching until many years later. So my point is, some of you are very familiar with backward design. It's just all you do, naturally. Some of you may be able to relate to my story. And if so, backward design will require a shift in your planning practice. But I think the shift is worthwhile. And once you get it, you'll never go back. So those are, in general, stages of backward design. Before I show you a planning template and we wrap up the session, I want to give you a chance to comment on your experience with this planning process, as well as what's being done in your school. Is this something that you yourself are comfortable doing and natural doing, and do others you work with plan this way? Or can you relate to my story? Is it a little bit different from what I'm recommending? Take another poll of your groupmates and comment on the planning practices of yourself and your colleagues. I'm going to finish my time during this session by sharing what I hope you'll find to be a practical planning template. This is the template that we use and encourage people to use when planning units of study using backward design. And rather than just tell you the template, I want to illustrate it with what I hope you'll find to be an interesting but also illustrative example. So the template basically uses, it's a graphic organizer essentially, and it uses the 3 stages of backward design embodied in a planning template. But here's something I want to mention before we look at the template. I have worked in some schools where the principal or a team mandated the use of understanding by design. The teachers receive the template and they're told to use it for their planning. And without understanding or without some professional development opportunities, they end up seeing it as one more thing to do and they have to fill in the boxes. Some of you are smiling because you've seen that. My view is don't even bother. This is not about filling in boxes. This is a way of thinking, prioritizing the curriculum, planning, and also a format for sharing. And one of the interesting opportunities is to share not only within your school, but across the world. With a common template, we can do that. And I'll show you either this session or my next session some wonderful resources for people using this template, and you can access their work online. But let's take a look at the template through an example. Now, I've always found you have to be careful with examples you use with a diverse, mixed group. If I take an example from physics or chemistry, those of you who aren't up on your physics or chemistry might feel a little inadequate. And if I take an example from grade 1, the secondary teachers will roll their eyes. So I picked something I think everybody can relate to, but it will be an interesting example, I hope, to play out what backward design can look like. And I'm going to focus on stage 1 right now. Okay, ready? Here's the example. Driving and learning to drive. Which in Buenos Aires is a particularly important skill. A high-stakes assessment, you might say. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions about driving. As I did before with understanding, I'm going to ask you just to think about, or if you have something to write with or write on, you can jot down your thoughts. Then I'll ask you to share your thoughts with your group mates, and I'm going to use your answers or the questions, perhaps, to look at the elements of the UDD template. And I think you'll find this interesting, and I hope illustrative. So here are the 3 questions, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds between each question. Don't talk just yet, please. You'll have a chance to talk after you respond to the 3 questions. Okay, here's question number 1. For a beginning driver, what does that beginner need to know, and what skills do they need to practice before we turn over the keys? You don't have to make an exhaustive list. It's just a few examples of knowledge and skills needed by a beginning driver. Think about it by yourself, 30 seconds. Okay, question number 2. Just need a few examples for the first. Question number 2 is interesting. What is it that we want a beginning driver to come to understand about driving? And a way of thinking about it is, what does an experienced and an effective driver understand that a beginner or a bad driver doesn't? See if you can identify 1 or 2 understandings, not just factual knowledge, but a conceptual understanding about driving. 30 seconds, but don't talk yet, please. Okay, third and final question for the moment. I'd like you, if you can, in one sentence, to describe the ultimate goal of a driver's training program. In a nutshell, what do we hope to accomplish for the driver? See if you can, in one sentence, identify our long-term goal. 30 seconds. Okay, thank you for playing along with the exercise. Now I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to share with your group mates. Just respond to all 3 questions: knowledge and skills, understandings, and your long-term goal. Let's look at our planning template through the lens of my 3 questions. Again, if we had a little more time, I'd love to hear what you were saying, but I can predict some of the things I believe, and I want to look at them using the Understanding by Design template. So we have several categories of our planning template in stage 1, and this is for desired results. One aspect are knowledge and skill objectives, or whatever topic we're teaching. In the case of driving, some things that you probably said. Students need to know the driving rules and regulations. They need to know the meaning of traffic signs and symbols. They need to know basic car parts and what they do. One that's not on my list, somebody suggested, what to do in case of an accident. That's important knowledge. And skills. We can list all the skills of a driver. Turning, parallel parking, merging into traffic, backing up, using mirrors, all the skills that are practiced. So that's familiar. Just as in teaching any topic, we know the knowledge and skills that are often specified in curriculum documents. But let's look at the second question I asked you, which gets at understanding by design. What are some things we want students to understand about driving that may not be obvious to a beginner, but very important nonetheless? Well, here were a few that Grant Wiggins and I proposed. See if you had any of these. One thing we want students to understand is the idea of defensive driving. You may be safe and careful and skilled, but there are idiots all around you. And they might do dangerous and unexpected things. I've already seen some of that in my drives here. And so that's a big idea, defensiveness. You have to be ever alert to what's going on around you. And that's not something a beginning driver necessarily gets right away. This is what we work on with them. Another idea is you have to vary your driving. One-size-fits-all driving is dangerous because different traffic, weather, road conditions will influence how you drive. In the same way that one-size-fits-all teaching isn't optimal, that's why differentiation is important. Same idea applies to driving, arguably. My point here is that there are some ideas that are not facts and they're not obvious, but they're really important to the performance of driving, and we want to cultivate and develop those understandings. We can use essential questions in our teaching of driving. Here were 2 that Grant Wiggins and I proposed as examples. What must I anticipate and do while driving to minimize risks and accidents? And what makes a courteous and defensive driver? We think we could teach many of the skills as well as develop understandings around those 2 essential questions. And we propose similarly, when you're teaching content, think not only about the ideas you want students to understand, but what essential questions can engage them and help them develop their understanding. The last question I asked you is an important dimension of understanding by design, and we put it at the top of our template. We call it transfer. What is it in the long run that we want the driver to do when mom, dad, and the driving instructor are no longer with them? We refer to this as the long-term transfer goal. When they're on the road on their own in different driving and weather conditions, what do we want them ultimately to be able to do by themselves? And arguably, you have something like this. We want them to drive defensively, be always attentive, and yet be courteous. And we want them to anticipate and adjust their driving to different conditions. Now you may have different wording, but I bet we could agree if we spend some time on the long-term goals. We propose that for schools and teams within schools, whether it's working at subject area, disciplinary knowledge, or the 21st century skills, the 6 C's, that we agree on the long-term transfer goals. We plan backward from those and say, what do students need, or what will they need to understand in order to transfer their learning? What essential questions will help deepen that understanding? And then we can go all the way back to the knowledge and skill objectives that are needed. So this is our template in a nutshell for stage 1. What about established goals like the RD King curriculum goals, or IB, or AP? Well, they're there. But marching through the standards of the outcomes is not the goal, I don't think. We want to unpack those established goals to derive the transfer understandings and knowledge and skill objectives. So let me leave you with an analogy that I think is apt, and you be the judge, and then we'll take our break. Think of the long-term transfer goal as equivalent to the game in athletics. It's what we want the team and the players to do well. And the game is a transfer goal because every game is different. The other team may not line up the way we practice, so we have to adjust. And we have to put together all the knowledge, skills, understanding, strategies, teamwork on the field, and the coach can't help you anymore. The team has to do it on its own. It's autonomous transfer. We plan backward from the game to plan practice. And in practice, we develop knowledge, skills, teach strategies, understanding about the game, and teamwork and conditioning. But every coach knows that the goal is not marching through the playbook. The goal is not working on isolated skills and testing them in isolation. The goal is always having the game in mind. The last part of the analogy before we break. I propose that every subject or disciplinary group in the school meet and agree on a small number of long-term transfer goals for mathematics, for science, for English language arts and literature. And once you agree, you're like the coaches for soccer. Because think about it, coaches of 5- and 6-year-olds just starting the game have the same game in mind as do secondary coaches and Olympic and professional coaches. It's the same game. What we do with young kids is going to be a lot more basic, but we have the same end in mind. One of the best ways of having a coordinated, viable, guaranteed curriculum is if everybody has the same game in mind that we're working toward. And we look at student work on a regular basis, just as coaches look at the game and derive next week's practice based on how kids did. So this is, in a nutshell, UBD. I'm going to get into this in more detail in my follow-up session, but I hope you found this interesting and I hope you will consider this framework. So I have one announcement, and is it possible to turn the lights on? So here's the announcement. We have a half-hour break, and you have 2 options after the break. You can stay in this room if you're interested in more on understanding by design, or you can go to, I believe it's the room just out the door to your right, where you will have the option of a second session described in your handout. So thanks for your attention.